I have sat in courtrooms for 60 years. I have watched murderers weep and innocent men stay perfectly still. I have seen mothers lie to protect their children and children lie to destroy their parents. I have watched the most educated men in the room make the most foolish decisions of their lives. And I have seen the quietest, most polite person in the courtroom turn out to be the most dangerous. At 87 years old, I am no longer practicing law, but I am still studying people. Because the courtroom is not just a place where crimes are judged. It is a mirror that shows you exactly who human beings are when everything is at stake. And what I discovered in those 60 years changed how I see every single person I meet. If you understand these lessons, you will never look at people the same way again. My name is not important. What is important is what I have lived. I was 27 years old when I first walked into a courtroom as a practicing lawyer. Young, confident, certain I understood people. I did not. Over the next 6 decades, I handled hundreds of cases. Murders, frauds, divorces that destroyed families, crimes committed by people you would never suspect, and crimes blamed on people who had done nothing at all. I sat across from killers. I defended the wrongly accused. I cross-examined liars, and I also cross-examined people who were telling the absolute truth, but nobody believed them. I watched judges cry behind closed doors. I watched prosecutors celebrate convictions they privately doubted. I was not always wise. I was arrogant in my 30s. I was burnt out in my 40s. I made mistakes. I misjudged people. I lost cases I should have won, and won cases that still trouble my conscience. But slowly, across 60 years, I began to understand something deeper than law. I began to understand people. And today, at 87, sitting quietly with more time behind me than ahead, I want to share what I learned. Early in my career, I defended a man who had been accused of robbery. He walked into my office in a perfectly pressed suit, calm handshake, soft voice. He looked at me with steady, honest eyes and said, "I didn't do it." I believed him completely. He was guilty. Years later, I was appointed to assist in a case involving a man who had been arrested for assault. He was unkempt, nervous. He could barely hold eye contact. The prosecutor was certain. The jury was leaning guilty within minutes. He was innocent. I have watched this pattern repeat itself more times than I can count. The well-spoken man who donates to charity on Sundays and terrorizes his family on Monday nights. The rough-looking, tattooed young man who wept in my office because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The courtroom strips away performance, eventually. But in the beginning, everyone performs. And here is what 60 years taught me. We are all trained from childhood to judge character by appearance, by clothing, by confidence, by how someone speaks. But appearance is the costume people wear for the world. It tells you almost nothing about what is underneath. Never judge character by appearance. The most important truths about a person are always hidden beneath the surface. In my first years of practice, I thought my job was to catch lies. I was wrong. My real job was to understand why people were lying. Because in 60 years of courtroom work, I have never met a person who was entirely honest. Not once. Criminals lie to escape punishment. That one is obvious. But victims lie too, out of shame, out of fear of not being believed, out of years of silence that have reshaped the story in their own memory. Witnesses lie because they are afraid of retaliation, or because they genuinely misremember what they saw, and their brain has quietly filled in the gaps without telling them. Even lawyers lie, to themselves mostly, convincing themselves their client is innocent because it is easier to fight for someone you believe in. And here's the uncomfortable truth I arrived at. Truth is never pure, and it is rarely simple. A person can be lying about the details while being completely honest about the feeling. A person can be telling the technical truth while hiding the most important part of the story. I stopped asking, "Is this person lying?" I started asking, what are they afraid of? What are they protecting? What pain made this lie feel necessary? Understanding why someone lies is more important than simply catching the lie, because the reason behind the lie is where the real truth lives. There was a case I carried with me for years. A young man, 24 years old, convicted of a violent crime, angry in the courtroom, cold. He showed no remorse, and the jury hated him for it. I was not his lawyer, but I was present during parts of the proceedings. After the verdict, I had a brief conversation with his public defender, and I learned that this young man had been beaten throughout his childhood, not occasionally, consistently, by the people who were supposed to love him. He had never once in his entire life experienced safety. I am not telling you this to excuse what he did. I am telling you this because understanding it changes something. In 60 years, I have seen this story told in 1,000 different ways. The woman who screams in court and is called unstable, who spent 15 years being silenced. The man who is labeled cold and unfeeling, who learned as a child that showing emotion brought punishment. Trauma does not announce itself. It walks in quietly and sits down in the defendant's chair. And it sits in the witness box too. And sometimes behind the judge's bench. Pain is not an excuse, but it is always an explanation. Behind anger, there is almost always pain. And the moment I understood that, I stopped seeing defendants as monsters. I started seeing them as people. Some of the worst decisions I ever witnessed in a courtroom were made by the most educated people in the room. I have seen brilliant lawyers destroy their careers over ego, unable to admit a mistake, unable to settle a case they were clearly losing because their pride would not allow it. I have represented wealthy, highly educated clients who made choices so reckless, so emotionally driven, that I sat across from them in disbelief. Doctors, professors, executives, people who had mastered their fields completely and could not manage their own judgment for a single moment. And I have also met people with very little formal education who understood people, situations, and consequences with extraordinary clarity. They were not book smart. They were wise. There is a difference. Intelligence is the ability to process information. Wisdom is knowing what to do with it. Wisdom comes from sitting with difficult experiences long enough to learn from them, from being wrong, from suffering consequences, from watching how things unfold across years, not just moments. You cannot read wisdom into existence. You cannot study it in a classroom. Wisdom comes from experience, not intelligence. And in my experience, the wisest people I ever met had often suffered the most. When people imagine a dangerous person, they picture aggression, raised voices, threatening posture, obvious anger. But the people who frightened me most in 60 years of law were quiet. They were calm in a way that felt unnatural, polite in situations where most people would crack, controlled when everyone around them was falling apart. I once sat across from a man charged with a serious crime. Throughout the entire meeting, he smiled at appropriate moments. He asked thoughtful questions. He was reasonable, measured, utterly pleasant. The evidence against him was overwhelming. There was not a single moment where his composure broke. That composure was not strength. It was the absence of something. The loud, aggressive person is reacting to their emotions. They are uncomfortable to be around, but they are readable. The controlled, pleasant, never-rattled person? You do not know what they are capable of, because they have never shown you. I learned to pay attention to stillness, to the person who never seems disturbed by anything, to the one whose calm exists even when calm makes no sense. The loud ones are easy to spot. The quiet ones are not. Watch for the stillness. I want to tell you something that took me too long to understand. Behind a significant number of the cases I handled was not greed, not pure evil, not even desperation. It was the feeling of not being heard. The employee who had reported mistreatment for years before finally breaking. The spouse who had asked quietly and then loudly and then desperately to be taken seriously. The young person who had been dismissed their entire life until they did something that forced the world to pay attention. The courtroom was full of unheard voices. People who had tried the right channels and been ignored, who had spoken softly and been talked over, who had trusted the system and been failed by it. And when people feel truly, completely unheard, they find other ways to be noticed. Not always healthy ways, not always legal ways, but ways. I am not saying every crime is a cry for attention, but I am saying that in my experience, genuine, patient listening prevents more disasters than any punishment ever could. Sometimes listening, truly listening, can prevent destruction. If we learned to hear people before they reached their breaking point, fewer of them would break. Early in my career, I lost a case that I believed in deeply. My client, I was certain, was telling the truth. But the evidence was arranged against him. The timing was wrong. The jury decided within hours. I carried that loss heavily. 11 years later, new evidence surfaced. My client was exonerated. 11 years. I have watched this happen in various forms throughout my career. Lies that seemed airtight, slowly developing cracks. Stories that were accepted as truth, quietly unraveling over years. Hidden documents that surface. Witnesses who, years later, can no longer carry the weight of silence. People who lied on the stand eventually tell someone the truth. And that truth moves. It does not always move quickly, but it moves. I stopped being impatient about truth after that case, because I realized that time does not forget. Time watches. Time accumulates. Time waits. And eventually time speaks. Time is the greatest judge, more reliable than any courtroom, any jury, any verdict. If the truth exists, time will find a way to surface it. I am 87 years old. I wake up slowly now. I sit with my tea and I look out the window for longer than I used to, and I think about the people I met across 60 years, the ones I helped, the ones I failed, the ones I misjudged, the ones who surprised me completely. I think about what I spent my energy on in my younger years, winning arguments, proving points, being right. I spent so much energy being right. And I think about what actually mattered, the moment a wrongly accused person could finally exhale, the families that stayed together because someone listened in time, the rare conversation in a quiet office where someone finally felt understood. That mattered. Not the victories, not the reputation, not the cases that made the news, the moments of genuine understanding. At 87, I no longer care about winning. I only care about understanding. Understanding people. Understanding why they do what they do. Understanding that behind almost every difficult person, there is a story I have not yet heard. That is what 60 years in a courtroom taught me. Not law. People. So let me leave you with this. You will meet people today who confuse you, who frustrate you, who seem impossible to understand. Before you judge them, remember that you are only seeing the surface. Remember that everyone is carrying something you cannot see. Remember that the quiet ones are often the most complex, that the angry ones are often the most hurt, that the liars are often the most afraid. I spent 60 years learning to see past the surface. You don't have to take 60 years. You just have to be willing to look. In the end, we are all just stories waiting to be understood. Be careful how you judge others. One day, when you know their full story, you may understand them completely. If this helped you see people differently, stay with me.